The Race and Identity Dialogue series came together during a time when our nation was forced to confront and respond to the evils of racism and prevalence of police brutality in the wake of violence and tragedy. We are sad and appalled. The Gun Violence Archive asserts that there have been over 100 mass shootings in the United States in 2021. Here, we find ourselves grieving over horrific incidents and the loss of lives. The murder of 8 people at spa businesses in Metro Atlanta on Tuesday, March 16th, and the murder of 10 people at the King Soopers grocery store in Boulder, Colorado on Monday, March 22nd. The anti-Asian prejudice against the Asian American and Asian American Pacific Islander people and the senseless hatred of anyone or group is anti-ethical to who this nation hopes to be, a land of the free, a home of the brave, and one that affords all the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. The Race and Identity Dialogue series hopes to interrupt and prevent acts of violence and hate. We do this through providing content that aims to increase knowledge, awareness, attitude, and skills in growing relationships and civic community engagement. Let's make efforts to stop rhetoric and habits of hate. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining the Race and Identity Dialogue session. This is session 6, and we are talking about parenting and telling stories. I'm Dr. Shawnette Parker, and I am delighted to be joined by multiple folks who I think are going to bring us different perspectives in this conversation. And we're not sure where it's going to take us, but we're excited to have the conversation. So please make sure you're joining along in the chat as we have this pre-recorded portion, and then we will come on live and continue to engage in dialogue. First, I'd like to bring it over to Ms. Sally Kaufman to please introduce yourself. Tell us more about you.
Thank you. I'm happy that you invited me. My name is Sally Kaufman. I have lived in this area since 1985. I first moved to McCormick, and then later we moved to Greenwood. And for the past 20 years, I have worked at Connie Maxwell Children's Home right here in Greenwood. I have 2 daughters. They're both married, and I have a couple of grandsons. So I'm very happy and interested in this subject.
I'm Mamie Nicholson, and I'm president of the Self Family Foundation here in Greenwood. Floyd and I are the parents of 3 sons. And we have 2 daughters-in-law and a granddog, Rockwell, and the granddog, Rockwell. I can't leave Rockwell out. I am so interested in this subject, and being the mother of 3 young men, looking forward to where this conversation takes us. Thank you so much for having me here.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity for being here. My name is Pedro Lopez. I teach foreign languages at Lander University. I've been with Lander for about 9 years now. And I'm not originally from the United States, but I've been living in this country in different states for about 20 some years. And I see that as part of my identity. And with that perspective on different cultures, that's what I try to transmit to my students.
I'm Demario Watts, and I serve as Director of Student Life here at Lander. So excited about the opportunity to talk about parenting. I'm also here to learn. I have a newborn who's about to turn 1 in June, and his name's Rowan. So I'm super excited about joining the conversation, especially during this specific time that we've been through over this last year as well. So I've had a lot of thoughts and a lot of time to reflect. So super excited about being a part. And thank you for inviting me.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you all for being here. It's kind of hard to decide where we jump into the conversation. As I was thinking about this and talking over it with our co-facilitator, Reverend Carter Thomas, the first thing that came to mind for me was the talk, and we've probably, I feel like in more recent years, that's become the thing, and we've kind of coined it as that, particularly when we think about the landscape, Black Lives Matter, and a lot in the heightened awareness of police brutality. And I think I use that term heightened awareness because it's not as if there's something new, but it's just something that I think has become more in the forefront of our minds. And at least for me, I know it's among my peers and friends, we're like, how do we talk to our children? What are we saying to our children? My youngest, we have 6, I have 5 bonus children, but my youngest is 9, about to be 10 at the end of the month. He won't let me forget. And it's interesting, yes, interesting the conversations that we've had and the questions that he's had. I remember even his first question to me about race, because he goes to a small private Christian school that is predominantly Black. I mean, I guess at this point I can say all Black. And one of the questions, I think he might have been 4 at the time when he was there in 4K. And he said, Mom, how come we don't allow white kids to come to our school? And that's not the case, but that was the way he saw it. And I think it was just interesting. It just what he was starting to ask me just about race. He has 2 older sisters who are much lighter skinned than him. And I remember at one point, he actually used to think that they were white. He said, my brothers are Black, but my sisters are white. And that's not the case either. And so it just kind of brought up in my mind, like, how do we formulate these conversations? What do we say? What is important for them to know? I'm always even thinking about my role in trying to push us toward a more culturally competent society. And I know that starts with our children, yet at the same time, I don't want to hold back on telling him some things that he might need to know to be safe within the communities in our society. So I'm kind of interested in that. So I'm going to pause, and I don't know who wants to jump in. And I know we have to be careful not to talk over each other, but I guess the first question that I would have in thinking about that is, especially in those earlier years, what are we saying to our children, especially when we're talking about identity as far as race? Because we know that in American society, that's very important. And that's one of the first things that's going to happen, that division and the separation based on the color of your skin.
I would like to I'd like to jump in right there and say, and this is that it pains me that you still feel the need to have that talk with your child. It pains me that still needs to happen, that you feel that still needs to happen. We should be to the point now where we do not need to have that talk. It just seems that lately the talk is more needed at this point than it has been in previous years, even. And that is the part that hurts me personally, is that I had this feeling and this vision that by now the talk would not be necessary. I thought Floyd and I have 2 generations of children. We had the twins who will be 42 this year. And then we had a 3rd son that came 13 years later, and he just turned 29. And I thought with the twins that, having the talk, their generation would end the need to have the talk. And now I thought with Michael that, that generation would end the talk. And then comes the incidents and the things that have happened over the last year or year and a half. And I think, okay, when do we not need to have the talk? And so that's one of the things that I wanted to get out here, is that we need to get to the point where there is no need to have the talk, where when your child leaves home, you feel as safe as when Sally's child leaves home. When my grandchild leaves home or my sons leave home, they don't need to have a different talk from what Sally would tell hers. Be safe, drive carefully, let me know when you get there, things like that any parent would want to hear from a child or a grandchild. So I'll stop there and let somebody else chime in, but that's one of the things that I'm wrestling with at this point in my life, that I've gone through the age of discrimination, of segregation and desegregation. And then my children, I thought would be different. And then that next child that came along in another generation, I thought that would be different. And now I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, okay, this is, anyway.
Yeah.
Yes.
I want to say, I agree. You know, I never thought I would have to have that conversation, but I knew I would if we were going to start having kids. I knew that was something that would come up. I thought about it a lot during the pandemic because, you know, you're at home, you're quarantining at this time. And when you're turning on the TV and you're noticing these, the shootings and the incidents that continue to happen. And so I remember sitting down with Lauren one day and I was in tears because, like, I'm going to have to really have this conversation with Rowan because he is a Black male, you know, and also thinking about, you know, what happens if I don't make it home? What do those conversations look like? And so it made it for me realize that it's going to be even more important that I start the conversation early. And then how can I show him too what representation looks like? How do I show him, you know, what happens in these certain situations, but making sure that I'm being delicate and intentional about what I say and what comes out through that conversation. You know, and I know now too that I'm not going to be ready for all of that when it does come, but I know it's one of those things that for me as a father, for him, making sure that I'm very, very intentional about having that, because I do want him to be more aware. I feel like we do have a lot of students sometimes that are not as aware about things that are happening, and even to their own communities. But you know, for me, it's important for him to have that conversation, to know that, hey, you know, these are things I need you to think about and be aware about, not to scare you, but also just to make you aware, because unfortunately, not everyone is going to appreciate you as much as we appreciate you and how you look and feel and how you live your life in this space.
You're starting to touch on just kind of getting into further detail of like what the talk is. And Mrs. Nicholson, you know, saying it, you're talking about being safe and make sure you call me when you get home. And Dr. Watts, you started, you know, bringing that up a little bit. And then Mrs. Nicholson, you alluded to like the difference in terms of the talk that Ms. Kaufman might have with her children. And I'm just kind of curious about that. Like, what is the talk and what does that look like? Because in my mind, I think we're talking about, you know, for me, it's being safe. I remember we were sending our, I guess he's one of our middle children off to college. He's at UNC Pembroke, and he was first starting to drive. And part of, I guess, my talk was make sure you put your registration in your window, the visor, and not inside the glove box. Like, that was so concerning for me. But it's interesting because I don't know if it's always just been one talk. It's been these pieces, and as things come up, it's like this continuous thing that you're saying. But I do remember moments where, in very poignant times, and my husband, he always has a specific talk with the boys and all the children when they went off to college, and hear the things. Now, of course, it probably had not everything to do with racial identity, right? And so many other things are involved in that. But it's interesting too, though, because then it was layered even for our Black boys, even in terms of how they build relationships, particularly when it came to white women. And that was a part of the conversation as well. So I'm just curious about some of the differences and what it is specifically talking about. And Mrs. Kaufman, I want to go to you in terms of what is even your interpretation of the talk that you believe, or you kind of seen that Black families need to have, versus the kind of talk that you may have with your children, particularly when we're talking about race relations?
For us, in our family, when our children came along, we emulated what I had experienced in my family. And it's hard for me to talk about that, but before I mention my father. He was born in 1927. He was raised in Elbert County, Georgia. I was born in 1953. There was no one talk. I was so blessed that my father was not a racist. Number one, when asked, he was a Christian. But secondly, he said, I served in World War II. And I realized I met people from all colors, from all regions, and I discovered that you got good and bad in every color. He was a minister, so I heard him preach, and we talked about race through all those years. It really started, I remember, as a preschooler. So when my children came along, I emulated it. My husband also happened to be a preacher, but I carried out fuller. So it was from the beginning, from when they came out of that womb. We chose to move to McCormick, South Carolina, and my kids went to the public school. It was all through those years. We're all readers in our family. We travel to different places. So I can't say one story about it. It was immersion every day through conversations, through books, through travel. I'm lucky. I thank God for my father. I cannot imagine what I could be like now if it hadn't been for him.
Interesting. And that tells us, and it gives us a glimmer into what needs to happen, right? So that we can and get to what Mrs. Nicholson said in terms of not having to have the talk more. And that's the goal with us having this dialogue and bringing this awareness, that if we can have more people that start with the children young and show what the behaviors are supposed to be like, perhaps we don't get to these places where we have to have this talk, right? Where you're inclusive.
We use books. But we went to McCormick, 77% Black in McCormick. Our children started there in their first years. Then we moved to Connie Maxwell, diverse situations. It started with reading to them. It started from the beginning. And there are books out there now. There's all this. But from the beginning, I would say, Demario, for you, I would say, from the beginning. And let them get to know white people.
Yeah. Dr. Lopez, I'm actually interested. So, because you said you're not originally from this country. And I just remember having a conversation when I was probably a teenager with peers in terms of when they first came over and some of the first things that they were learning as children or warnings that they received from parents. And I know that some of their parents may have received warnings about certain groups of people and just kind of being brought into this landscape of this construct of race that we have in the United States and what that looks like. And, some of the frustration that I even felt, even coming, because she was a friend of mine and she was actually from Brazil. And she, just very transparent, was like, I was always told that I'm not supposed to hang around with you as a Black person. Now, and I'm not saying that that's a Brazilian culture, and I know you're not Brazilian, but I'm just saying I don't know if it's that or if it's just her family specifically, but it's interesting. So I'm wondering just what did you notice when you first moved to the United States? What have you seen in the different places in which you've lived in terms of this relationship? And perhaps is it a different kind of conversation that an immigrant may have with their children in terms of how you fit into this American landscape?
Well, the first thing I have to say that I've noticed was that how racialized this society is in comparison to where I came from. So I come from a relatively small country with, at the time at least, a relatively homogeneous demographics. And so I actually have a funny story out of my experience. And so I was in conversation with a student of mine, a few states ago in a different university. And I don't recall exactly what we were talking about in particular, but some difference between me and him came up. And he said at some point, yes, that's because I'm white. And I have to say that, wait, what? Until then, I never realized I was not white. Never crossed my mind because, it was never talked about. It was just not a thing. Race was not a thing. And so it turns out that in this country, just unbelievable, but not just the different ethnicities. We're talking about a very complex spectrum, and so coming from a place where, for us, the Chinese are white, The Latin Americans are white. The Middle Easterns are white. They're all white. They're just maybe a little tanned, you know? And then we have the Africans who are black. It was that simple. That was at least my experience growing up. Does that make sense? And so coming here, all of a sudden, you know, after being told that I was white, all of a sudden I realized, wait a minute, so I'm not white. Okay. I mean, that does not interfere with my identity in the least, but it was interesting to see how others were around me were viewing me, differently than I thought they were, which is, you know, interesting. So, and it turns out in this country too, there's this whole spectrum, you know, from very white to, you know, so-called, I would say, Anglo, which is a more accurate definition, to, you know, all the way to black citizens. And then so there's a huge range in the middle that actually it appears to count, to the differentiation counts, and that was very surprising to me. So that was one thing that was almost shocking to me, how, you know, how it matters. It turns out it matters, but so it was strange to me from my perspective. But I still believe, though, and following up with your example of Brazil, that the issue is more socioeconomics than racial.
Yes.
I do believe that's where it all begins, and then race and ethnicity is just the visible part of the very, very large income and gaps that we have in this country, and also in Brazil, which is a very multiracial society as well, but divided more along the lines of social economics than race, in my perspective.
Well, and that, you know, I just like to comment on that. That has something to do with it. But I just finished reading and just completed reading an article that was written by a superintendent of schools who happened to be an African American male. And he and his two sons, his first cousin and his uncle, were out walking on their family property and encountered two white men with guns who were trespassing on the property of the black men. And he talked about his fear of meeting two white men who were trespassing on his property and with guns, and him feeling that he needed to explain himself to them as opposed to them explaining to him why they were on his property with guns. You know, those are the kind of things that it didn't matter that he was a superintendent of schools. It did not matter that one of his sons was a student at the Naval Academy. It doesn't matter that his first cousin, who was with them, is an administrator with the National Science Foundation. It did not matter that his other son is in the top 10% of his high school class. All that mattered at that moment were that they were black men in the woods, unarmed, and they met two white men who had guns. And they felt a need to explain themselves to these white men who were trespassing on their property. Until we get to a point where that doesn't happen, we can't say it is economy, economics, socialization, all of that is a piece of it, but it cannot explain away something that happens like that. It has to go a lot deeper to get to the point where where race doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Race does matter. Race does matter. People say, I don't see race, I don't see color. You can't help but see race and color. It's not that you don't see it, it's that it is not the only thing you see.
Mhm.
That you see the value of that person, that person is the same as me. Their skin color is just a little, it's a different shade. They're all different shades of Black people, all different shades of white people, all different shades of Asian people, of everybody. So, but once a child is identified as Black or African American, there is a need for them to know that they will be suspect in certain circumstances. There is a need to have the talk. There is a need to say, when you go into a store, don't enter that store without having some money in your pocket, because you will be watched as you go about that store to pick up something. If you are stopped by the police, please be sure to keep your hands where they're visible to the police officer. Please respond with your best manners. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. All of that. There is the need to say, if you go out at night, be careful, pay attention to your surroundings, and always, if possible, go in a group. Go have someone else with you. There is a need for parents who look like me to be in touch with their children when they are away from home on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Just to be sure that they are okay. So that's the pain of all of that, and we can't dismiss that pain without having these conversations.
Yes.
We need to have these conversations.
We do. And, it's so hard as you were talking about that. And I'm always then thinking, because what's my follow-up? I was horrified one time. I was in the grocery store with my son. He's getting his independence. He has his own bank card now. He went ahead and went to the self-check and bought his item, I think a candy bar or something else. And him not thinking, he's like, I paid for it, and he stuck it in his pocket. He didn't get a bag. And I flipped out. And I was just like, oh my God, no, you got to take them. He's like, but I didn't steal anything. And I was like, no, absolutely, right now. Get your receipt. And like in the car, literally sitting 10-15 minutes explaining to him why and what it looks like, and that you could have been accused of stealing something that could have created a whole incident. And I had to pull myself back, though, because I was I was scared he didn't understand why for him. Yes, that I felt that way, and then being able to try to pull back. But I always try to find myself like, so what's the fault? I warn him of the danger, but I don't want him to feel this division between him and white peers. I don't want him to feel like he's any less than, and I want him to feel like he can continue to have his friends. And that's where I'm always questioning, like, so then what's the follow-up? And I like what Mrs. Kaufman, you said about immersion. And, I try to give him multiple experiences. And like you said, being around white people, understanding those scenarios, but it's those moments that terrify me. I saw your hand, Sally, go up. Did you? Go ahead.
I did. And so listening to that, what I try to do as well, and my father did for me, not only can we raise children with a love for all races, we need to teach them to be advocates for racial reconciliation. We need to say, not only is this it, you need to be an advocate and stand up. And you see someone mistreated, or bigger than that, you be an advocate and be passionate. And I'm so happy both of my daughters are living up to that.
That's great. That's great. That's great. I agree with that. And you encourage them to have all kinds of friends, and you encourage them to have friends in your home, so that they can learn about you and encourage and allow them to affiliate and to get to know the parents of the children that they are with on a daily basis. I say when they're young, they should be invited to each other's birthday parties and all of that kind of thing. That's the way we did with our children. We had all races of children, and their friends continue to be all races of young people, young adults, as they are. If you foster that in your child, you don't want them to be afraid. You want them to be safe. You do not want them to be afraid, and you do not want them to dislike a race. You want them to know that they are good and bad in all races. And in order to find out who's the good and who's the bad, you have to be open and honest and be willing to communicate and to get to know people. And then you can decide whether you like this person just because you like them, or you don't just because they're just not a nice person and they don't fit with your personality or whatever, but not just, I don't like them because they are this shade of brown or that shade of white or whatever. So having them in your home and modeling it as parents. People say we're friends, but they never visited each other's homes. Mm-hmm. They've never sat at a table together and had a meal. And yet they say, oh, this person is one of my best friends. This person is not one of your best friends, because if they were your best friend, they would be in your home, whether they are invited or not. I mean, my next door neighbor and I, well, actually, we have several neighbors right here in our circle. That's why I love where I live. But that we go back and forth all the time, and we take meals back and forth, or we share this, or we share that. And I mean, our little neighborhood is like a neighborhood that we all dreamed about, is where I call my neighbor and say, do you have an egg? I don't want to go back to the store. And those kinds of things. So they call and they want a cup of sugar or a cup of flour or whatever, and they come over and get it. We have keys to each other's houses. So if we need something and the other's gone, the neighbor called the other day and asked, and told Floyd, I went in the yard and I got your aerator. So I mean, he just called him and told him, I went in the yard and I got the aerator. That kind of thing. We go in their garage and get the bicycle pump. Those kinds of things. And these people, the shade of their skin is not the same as mine, but we love each other. We genuinely know each other, and we genuinely love each other. Mm-hmm. And so that's what it's about. It's about building those one-on-one relationships and actually being true to who you are. I don't expect them to change who they are. They don't expect me to change who I am. We know each other and we love each other in spite of each other. And that's just what it's going to take to get us out of this mess.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Lopez, did you want to add to that?
Yes, if I may. And that is ideal. That is exactly should be our goal. However, there are forces in society that, again, and then from my perspective, incomprehensible things that keep pulling us apart. Let's talk about the churches, for example. Why is that I drive around and I see churches just for blacks and churches just for whites? This is, from an European perspective, it's just incomprehensible. So while we maintain the status quo, as many efforts as we develop in the sense of, getting everyone on the same bandwagon, like the churches, the God is the same, but yet there are these forces that keep pulling us apart that it shouldn't be. Yeah, shouldn't be.
I'm not sure I completely agree, sir. A lot of that has to do with a cultural difference of desired worship style. For instance, I've been told at Connie Maxwell Children's Home, and I've heard others say it, love you, Sally, but man, your service is boring. So I believe our churches are more open than they look. And frankly, there's some white churches I'm not going to. It has to do with the style as some of the content.
Yeah.
Yes.
I agree with that. Yeah. I mean, to some degree.
Yeah, I know.
And so it is. It's a balance, because you're right. Because there are I want to celebrate our cultural expressions as well. And I'm with you. So it's like, I think there's a difference between feeling invited, right, and feeling welcome versus going where your preference is. And I think, though, on the outside, it does feel like, though, if we look at the example of churches or different places, that because of how they're set up, sometimes you can get the feeling that, no, I'm not welcome there. But I have been to some very mixed race churches where it's open. And then there's some here, though, like you said, might choose not to go there just because, like you said, the service, I just like a good old Southern Baptist more style of church. And
Come on over.
right. And so, and you're right. And so you can find that. So it is interesting, but I think that's almost on a different level, because you're right. It's like, we're in my conversations with my children, it's not so much that I'm saying we have to then melt, right? It's not about having this melting pot.
No.
But we should be able to move among society feeling comfortable, not feeling like you're automatically going to be singled out for different things. Please keep your difference, express yourself how you want, but we need to be able to get to a point to where we can just be and exist and not have to worry, is it because I'm Black that something happened, and that kind of thing. And that's the challenging part. We have to start wrapping up this portion of the conversation. We're going to have a lot, but I wanted to have each of you reflect on something because it stuck with me. Recently, I was in listen to Jane Elliott. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her, the blue-eyed, brown-eyed experiment or experience that she did with the third grade children, and trying to get them to understand, the difference and understand discrimination and what that feels like. And, she's had some profound data, and she's gone on to continue, even after teaching third grade, to just be an advocate for, race relations. But as much as I admire some of the work that she's doing, she had said something, this is a few weeks ago, she did a talk for Richland County Libraries. And it was a Black parent who had asked, she was like, my 5-year-old is asking me questions, just about race, and some things have been happening. And I'm just curious, like, what do you think? How should I talk to her about race? And Jane Elliott said, which I look at this to be somewhat of a microaggression. She was like, well, don't talk to her about race. Tell her that we're all a part of the human race, and that's it. And that we're just all the same, and she's a part of the human race, and she shouldn't feel inferior. And I'm like, it's a great novel idea that we would just wake up one day and nobody sees the difference in color. If I think about the Netflix show Bridgerton that's there, and nobody seemed to notice that the queen was Black and all these different things, I want to be able to move around and operate. But I'm like, but the reality is, like Dr. Lopez said, but we keep coming back. There's this divide that pushes us from that. And so I'm curious, even you all's thought on that, because my initial thought is that, yes, I tell my son he's human, that we're all the same, that he shouldn't feel any inferiority when it comes to anyone, Asian, white, Latino, whatever. We're all equally, and he shouldn't treat anyone different because he doesn't have any superiority either, and that he can get along with whomever. Yet I still always say, but there's always that big but. Here's how other people are going to see you. So I personally disagree with the whole teach the human race thing. I'm just curious, like, to go around, and what do you all think?
I'm tired of people saying, why are they talking about Black Lives Matter? All lives matter. Please, there is a different level. We've known white lives matter. We've been told that. I mean, just look at everything, but it's specifically a different issue, because these Black lives have not felt that they mattered, and they still don't. I think sometimes we have to look at people and realize it's unwillful ignorance. It needs to be addressed. Mm-hmm. But I can easily say it, can I? Because, it's easy for me to say it.
Dr. Watts?
Yeah, I agree with both of you as well. I do want to have that conversation about what it means to be human, but I also want my son to be able to validate his own skin, right? I want him to be proud of what he brings to the table. And I want him to be proud of what the differences he sees in other folks. And so for me, I want him to be proud of being a Black male, and what does that mean in various lights, because there's a lot of great things that come with that. We talked about culture here. We talked a lot about, just those different commonalities and things that he, will get to experience. But I also don't feel that it's best for me to send him out into this world with all these false narratives of things, and then him experience it and go, wait a minute, you really lied to me. You really did not tell me this is going to happen, or, you know, so I want to be open about it. I want to have the full conversation. I also want to be as transparent as I can be, because I rather, you know, I'm not going to be able to prepare him from everything, but I at least want him to be able to go back and think about, okay, does this fit within my values? Does this fit with what I've been taught? You know, and maybe even challenge some of the things that I've thought and that I've said, but then also be able to round that back. So I want to make sure that, you know, that he feels happy and proud for who he is and realizes what he can bring to the table. And so that does curb the conversation for me. Yes, you know, it's great to talk about being a human race, but at the same time, when he's going to be seeing these narratives, when he goes back and reviews history, when he's, you know, all these different things, there are going to be those questions. And I want him to know that, okay, these are things that have happened. This is where I believe that we're at. And this is where there's a lot of work that still needs to go. And there's a lot of other things we could talk about with power and privilege that I want to talk with him about too. And he is in a blended family. You know, Lauren's family is predominantly white, mine's predominantly Black. So he's going to have a lot of experiences there, but I'm excited to have that conversation. And I've also been having that conversation with my family who identifies as white too. And I don't hold back, because again, I'm proud of who I am and what I put out there. And I want him to have that same experience too. So, building those narratives and talking to him very intentionally and transparent is where I see to go in that.
Dr. Lopez, do you have any thoughts on that? We're all just the human race. Unmute yourself. Yeah.
I do have some mixed feelings about that, because I see myself as a secular humanist, so human race above all. But I do see the point. And so I do agree, but differences should be highlighted insofar as they're celebrated, not as a basis for creating false sense of superiority of one over the other and discrimination. So that's when the problem arises.
Yeah.
I disagree with Mario in the sense that he talks about pride, and it's a personal belief of mine, somewhat philosophical approach of mine, that we should not be proud of things that we didn't have a part in. And so I think it's it's a matter of identity than of pride. You know, I see people, oh, I'm proud of being American. Oh, what'd you do? You know, we were just born and didn't have anything to do with anything. Yeah. Now, if you're happy to be an American, you know, because of your identity, okay, that's a different story. You know, I'm proud of the Eiffel Tower. Did you build it? Yeah, so I have a little problem with that. But that's just me.
I never thought of it that way, and that gives me something to think about. That's a new perspective that I like that. I'm going to give that more thought. That's probably a whole nother conversation, but you add a whole nother layer of thinking for me to consider what I'm saying when I say that, and I appreciate that. So I'm going to hold on to that, Jim.
I think it's a matter of identity. It's identity, not pride, identity.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
That's a good point. I like that. I like that. And Mr. Nicholson, any thoughts on that?
Well, I just go back to one of our sons being in the sandbox with some of his little white friends, and one of them asking him why the inside of his hands were light,
Right.
and he was dark on the other side of his hands. And you know, this was when they were 3, 4, 5 years old, you know, in the sandbox at preschool, had not started kindergarten yet. This was at daycare. And he just said, God made me that way. And you know, never thought anything about it. And so then his teacher felt a need to call me to be sure that we would be okay if he came home and told us he had been asked that by another child. And I said, well, did it upset him, or did it cause any problem for him or anything? And she said, oh, no, he just went on playing. He just said, God made me that way, and just kept playing. And there was no more conversation about it. And I said, you know, that's the innocence of children. They don't see any difference. If they do, they ask the question. So that child just wanted to know why are your hands lighter and then dark on this side. God made me that way. That's what he said. And until we can look at each other and ask that question like that child did and say, God made me that way, and keep on playing, keep on talking, or whatever we're doing, I'm thinking we're all equal. And that's how we need to teach our children, that you're no better than and you're no less than. God made all of us, and he made us all this way. This is who we are.
Yeah, so that is a good point to wrap this portion of our conversation on, that God made us that way. And I guess the $1 million question then, it gets further in terms of how can we continue to create experiences for our children and get them to understand, so that they feel comfortable with just leaving someone with that response. God made me that way, and I can continue to engage with you, and we can connect with one another, and we're going to be okay. And I wish it was as simple as playing with the child in the sandbox, right? And that we can move on and those issues would be solved. But this is why we do what we do. This is why we continue to have these conversations.
That's right.
Learn so much from one another. We could probably talk for hours. And I know that, you know, when we go into the live portion, we'll probably run out of time, but we'll keep having the conversation. So again, we hope that you stick around for the rest of our conversation, continue to engage in the chat feature, making sure that you're also finding other folks that you can engage in conversation with. All right, and we're up, and thank you guys so much for joining in the chat. I am going to actually go to Dr. Lopez first, because your comment, that's the last one that we've seen some conversation about, and just giving you a chance to talk about that more. You know, we were thinking about it, and we understand that perspective, so I'm just curious for you to kind of give more meat to your point and see if we can understand that better. The pride, the having pride, and I see Mr. Kimler is asking questions about that as well. So what more can you share with us about that?
I think it has to do a lot with the definition of pride, and it's my own. It's you know, I guess I give it my own undertones. You know, I define pride as something that you're happy accomplishing yourself. So can you be proud of some other person's accomplishment? Yes, because you identify with them. It's just that simple. Yeah. But that's my view. I mean, this is not mathematics. This is not an exact science, you know. But because our series here has identity in its title, I think it's appropriate. I thought it was appropriate to I think separate the waters. And a lot of times, many times, that I the word pride is thrown around. I think it's more a matter of identity than pride, in my humble opinion.
No, I understand, and I hear that, and I find myself, and just even recently in my cultural competence course, I guess when I try to break down for the students, like our last conversations was about attitudes and behavior, and specifically talking about the difference between racism and prejudice. And I know that in many ways, the terms racism and prejudice are used synonymously. But then I guess based on the literature and the research and how it breaks it down, and I view racism as more of that systematic structure, because the question became, you know, and I hope this isn't taking us off on a big tangent, but it was about whether or not Black people can be racist. And there's been conversations about that. And, you know, and I certainly agree that people of color can be prejudiced and have prejudice, but I equate racism to this whole systematic structure. And it's for those who have the power to prevent and to continue to oppress. Yet, you know, I still had people say, no, but I've seen where Black people are racist. And so I understand where you're coming from in terms of also how you define certain terms and how you view it. So, I mean, we don't have to even get into that deeper, but it makes sense. Did anybody else? Alexis, I see you nodding. Did you have any additional comments or on that?
No, I was agreeing with you. Yes. And
okay.
I liked, Bill Kimler's comment about having pride in accomplishments of others may be a natural and necessary reaction to having others tell you that you are lesser because you belong to a certain group. And then he used the example earlier of Vice President Harris. And I can relate to that. And I think when maybe even in parenting, there's something about children seeing models of who they want to become, or models that defy prejudice and stereotypes, and that push back against even some of the violent language that was mentioned earlier in the chat. And I do think it's encouraging to see models that evoke pride in a world that tries to evoke a sense of oppression and depression in people groups.
So as I was listening to our conversation back and kind of looking at the comments and thinking about, to some degree, kind of where we go from here, and still wanting to hear from others in terms of what your experiences have been, whether, you know, what you were taught or what you teach your own children. And, you know, I was looking at also how I think Cass and Dr. Souther Dodds are talking about some of those subtle instances of racism and prejudice that were happening and that they grew up around and they later came to recognize. And then I'm hearing that layered with our conversation and this need to be very explicit about, I guess, the way I describe it, it's this explicit warning to my children of here's how you're going to be viewed as a Black person. I hate that I have to give them this warning, but for me, that's the language that works for me. But then I listened to Mrs. Kaufman in terms of, so a remedy to that and others were saying it's about teaching our children how to be advocates and to stand up. I'm missing for myself in some ways then that explicit conversation with them in terms of, so how do you combat that? And I guess I want to hear from you all talking about it. So what does it look like? Because it's easier said than done. Like I can literally say, this is how I teach my son about race and how he's going to be viewed and those warnings. But then how do we say exactly, what does it look like when you're being an advocate? What does it look like when you are pushing back on all of this? So I don't know who wants to kind of take that. Go ahead.
Can we move to Sally just because her comments
Yes.
about advocacy in the recording? I'd love to hear more about what that looks like for parents.
Well, again, we read books and we traveled a lot. We traveled to battlefields. We traveled to Gullah culture, we travel. And so in those conversations, there came up what people before us have done. Now, with my children, I had 2 girls, but as we were talking and all, I helped, my posture on it is, you're a white girl, you probably won't get beat up. So whenever you hear anybody talking about anything racist, put a stop to it. Tell them you're not going to stand there and listen to that. If someone is mistreating a Black person or anybody else, stand up. You're not going to put, and so I remember one of my daughters had a little button, some Martin Luther King button, and she wore it everywhere, and people asked, where have you been? And she said, I love Martin Luther King. And so it was in standing up to between a bully or someone who's mistreating someone, and was also just in verbiage of, I'm letting you know who I am, and nothing or anything else specifically. I mean, I'm very dramatic, and I have a temper, so I'm not sure I'm the best one to ask, because I've been forward with people, and I don't know that I would advocate for that. But to definitely stand up, voice your opinion, and what will not be tolerated around you.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Alexis, go ahead.
No, that actually reminded me of something I've forgotten. Well, at the beginning of the pandemic, when most of us were distancing and not out, my first kind of catch up was with Sally, and we picked up coffee and we sat in our cars. And
Are you really going to tell them?
And because it's an example of what you said, and I forgot. And so a white male comes up and he's yelling about, why do we have to wear masks and all this? And of course, I'm just here to see my friend, coffee in the car. And I, just noted this is why we should wear masks, and it's not just about you, and you probably have some sense of privilege that may not. So he went on, no, I know people who died. I just don't want anyone infringing on their rights. And I, at that point, wasn't willing to continue this conversation. I was exhausted already by what was happening in the world. And Sally did an incredible job where she didn't have to. One, she already had on a hat that said eracism. And then she went in and just had this conversation about this with this person about why masks were important and why COVID-19 was wrong. And she just shared. And when she said she's passionate, gets angry, but it was this beautiful passion of advocating not just what I felt like was for me, but for people who don't often get to be heard. And I thought this is a great example of what it means to advocate for people. It's not the stuff that we plan, right? It's not just showing up at a protest or march,
Right.
but it's in the moment of like sitting in our car, we're having coffee, and someone, just walks up and starts talking about how ridiculous it is that our local coffee shop is requiring masks. And she did a great job. And so that, that's the kind of advocacy I hope from friends and colleagues, just in everyday life. So thank you, Sally.
I also wanted to add, and I think it's interesting because I know I had, it was a text that I had used in the cultural competence course, and it's along those lines. And it was more of a blog post that was written by a white woman. But she was also saying there's a fine line to that because sometimes it's about just witnessing. And I'm going back, there was a comment in there where someone, I forget who made the comment, I'd have to scroll back through, talking about like also, I think Dr. Souther Dobbs had said it, not wanting to come across, you're well-intentioned as a white person wanting to help, but having to be careful that, when you're trying to I guess, save people of color and feeling like for me, I call it the Miss Millie syndrome, if you're familiar with Color Purple. And Miss Millie said, I did everything for everybody. Won't you come be my maid and that kind of stuff. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. And she just thought she was being helpful. So there's also this fine line of being careful not to immediately feel like you have to come to the rescue. And that's hard, right? And I even find myself, I'll play witness first in certain situations. Do I need to intervene? And I'm going to stay by just to make sure and to double check. But I'm not going to jump immediately there. I've found it happen. Teenagers. I was one time driving and there was a Black teenager who was pulled over, and he was a boy, and he was having, interaction with the police officer, and I just waited. You know what I mean? And I wanted to be there to, that kind of thing, but it wasn't necessarily a place to fully jump in. So that's kind of, a difficult thing there. So yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I appreciate you saying witness, because it made me think about just other situations that I've sat in before. And I was going to say, when it comes to advocacy for me and that growth, sometimes it's just based off the experience. So, I've been in a room before where someone has said that they don't see color. And so in my mind, I'm processing what does it actually mean when I'm the person of color sitting in the room. And then I wait and see who's gonna, I have that moment. I'm like, okay, so I have some friends in here, who's gonna address this, because I don't want to always come off as the one that has to address everything, or I'm the intimidating one, or whatever the case may be. And so I realize that sometimes, that advocacy comes with being able to sit back and wait, but then also with that experience. And I appreciate Sally mentioned anger too, because I like passionate better too. Because at some point, sometimes it does come out, at points where you're tired, you're exhausted. And it's like, at this point, I can't stand back and allow this to continue to happen. So sometimes it comes in those moments of, I'm seeing this, I'm watching this, and it looks like I'm going to have to be. Sorry, but figuring out who, to be that one to go ahead and push in and say what's next.
Well, I admit that, and I think I started, I've always been a petite. So I'm not sure if I don't know, if I had been a really big white guy, I mean, I just have to judge what's actually worked for me. So, me being passionate, I, haven't really gotten beat up or anything like that. But if I had been a man, I probably would have reacted just a little bit differently. I do want to tell you a quick story though. My daughter we went back to McCormick, and she was seeing a guy, and he drove up, and I thought he was awfully cute. He was her age. She was in high school. He drives up, and he's driving this really huge truck with this huge Confederate flag on it. She goes, "Watch this, Mom." So I'm like, oh my goodness. So he comes up and he's talking, and she goes, "Oh, listen, did you drive up in that white truck with that big, huge flag?" And he goes, "Oh yeah, I love that. That's the biggest flag you can drive with your truck." And she goes, "Yeah, a guy at my school in Greenwood has the same thing." He goes, "Yeah, I love that." And then my daughter said, "Oh, I'm proud of her." She said, "Yeah, I thought it was yours. He's got it, the same one. And he's an idiot too." Now, I don't say that people should say that, but she did that. And I was proud of her because she needed to say it. I'm sorry.
Yes. I mean, and sometimes it just, I choose not to edit myself at times too. And I know there might be moments in which I'm taking a risk. And so it's definitely something that comes with experience. And as I'm working with my students, and
Yes.
I'm telling, because that's the big question. We're entering into our unit about now, how do we put all this together and teaching the skills of this? And I'm like, there's no right answer. I was like, I think it's kind of trial and error. Sometimes you're going to be really successful in combating it. Sometimes it can blow up into something horrible. But you have to stand your ground.
In this situation, she knew him. She had grown up with him. So it wasn't like a stranger. She knew him very well. And so that worked for her at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do think there's a difference, what Ms. Kaufman said and how we talk to people, going back to what Dr. Watts mentioned. I think there's a way of speaking up when you do know the person, and how if you're in a meeting and someone says, "I don't say," or, they say something that you're like, this is probably offensive to someone in this room, or especially someone in this room, but someone period, and not speaking up. I think there's a different responsibility perhaps when you know the person who said it, even if it means going to them after the meeting. Maybe you don't say "you idiot," but you say something to say like, what you said, or, something to the extent that some of us can have conversations with people that others cannot. And so those who can have those kind of real conversations and it might be heard differently, right? I think it goes back to parenting and telling stories, right? The hope is that our children hear the stories differently coming from us. Do you mind, Dr. Parker, if I'm curious, Dr. Lopez has quiet, but has said some really insightful things. And Dr. Lopez, I would love for you to take a moment to share. You did mention the country you grew up in, and so I'm interested in hearing that. I think I know, but they don't know. And so would you say more about maybe wisdom and advice that those of us who have spent all or most of our lives here in the United States should know, should be aware of around this topic?
I have little wisdom to share. but I am passionate about traveling, and I'm a firm believer that traveling, going places, seeing different people, eating different foods, looking at different lifestyles and ways of thinking and perspective goes a long, long, long way to coming home and making a difference when you come home and you start putting things in perspective. So that is, that's not wisdom, but it is experience. Yeah. And by the way, it's by doing that where I came up with the idea of pride different than identity. By the way, it relates, because after being in so many places, and I realized, there's not been a place yet where I would not like to go back to. And there's nothing that I have not eaten in these places that I would not eat again, you know? And then I started thinking, okay, where does this put me? You know, so am I proud of my country? But, you know, I like these other countries too. So what is it? What is it that when the national team plays, you know, I'm talking soccer, of course, when is it, and then they see the flag, why does the heart beat a little faster? Is it pride? You know, no, because I can be just as bashful of the country and their politicians and their ways as of any other. So what is it? It's identity. That's where I came up with the idea. And so if you help me figure this one out just by going different places, he may help us with other things too.
Before we shift, say more about that, because I agree, and I think I've been changed for traveling, and I noticed in the chat earlier, Carolyn mentioned growing up in a military family and what happens when you live in different places, and that kind of neighborly camaraderie that's built that Mrs. Nicholson talked about of sharing with your neighbors and such. So I'm curious to know what people might gain by that from traveling. What specifics do you personally have gained, but also that others gain?
Oh, what can we not gain? We gain everything, you know. It's just let me tell a story. My grandfather one time told me something that really made an impact, so much that I'll be mentioning it to you here today. He said to me one day, and of course he grandfather, he's not alone among us anymore, and he was born in a time where going to school, even to elementary school, was a luxury back where I come from. He told me one time, if you ever want to learn anything, you need to travel or read. Since I cannot read, I travel. And so he would go on these little excursions without ever leaving the country. But, you know, the idea was there. It's the same principle. He would go places. Him and his wife would get on these little bus rides across the country to go visit these insignificant things. But you know what? He left his little town every once in a while and go see different places. And he told me that. And I, you know, still to this day, it is so very true. So in a day that we read less and less, you know, because of so many reasons, maybe if we can travel more and we can offset the gap that's left by the lack of readership these days. You know, we don't read hardly anything. I go to the library, to any library, and I don't see anyone there. And people are reading things of, you know, just really just low quality reading, just you know, beach reading, what I call beach reading. It's not valuable, insightful things that make you think. You know, so let's replace that with something else equally valuable. We're almost as valuable. So traveling, let's go places.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. And I like that you said it doesn't have to be like flying across an ocean, right? In your grandfather's case, that traveling can look like a lot of things. And then Sally, even going back to reading and traveling, this theme of teaching our children through stories, right? Through storytelling and the things that they remember years later, even after we're gone, these stories and these lessons of reading and travel can be a way of teaching about race and identity, their own and that of others, cultures and such. So thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
I do think, in talking about the reading, I think we don't read history. I think we may read how to do a computer technology. We may read People magazine. And history, unfortunately, and I'd love to have South Carolina address this, we don't emphasize history in schools. A lot of times the teacher isn't even a history major. But people aren't reading history. And therefore, we fall prey to, say, in terms of racial issues, the lost cause that we've all been taught here in the South. People, if they don't read, they're not going to realize that was all fiction. So if we could do anything to help our state understand race relations, we need to read history.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree with that. And you know, even, or just, we talk about traveling, some people don't even travel to the other side of town, you know, and communicate that way, or, you know, go to the next city and that kind of thing, even if it starts there, or going to the different type of restaurant or something. So even if it's that, you know what I mean? Like you said, it doesn't have to be across the waters, even though I encourage that. And that's one of the things I try to tell students as much as possible if you can, but even just getting out of your neighborhood, you know, the places that you know, super important. I want to snatch a seat from someone. We have to, in order to bring Dr. Souther Dobbs up, and I know Brahm is in the background working on it. We're going to bring you guys back, whoever he pulls off camera, but I wanted to engage further. And so I'll keep chatting as he's working to kind of do that, and go ahead and bring Dr. Souther Dobbs up and having that conversation. And so, because I know for me, a lot of times too, when it comes to, you know, telling people you need to get out, you need to travel. And it amazes me how many students say, this is when I was growing up in Indiana, that they had never been outside of the state of Indiana, or that they had never, you know, even students here in South Carolina had never. Hi, Dr. Souther Dobbs. Thank you for coming up.
Hi.
I wanted to jump in and add, and as we're trying to talk about like what this advocacy looks like, what it looks like to be able to combat some of these things, and you had mentioned just some realizations that you came to when you were younger, or reflecting back on your younger life and where you grew up. And I'm even just curious then, where did you find your voice, or what is that voice for you like for you now, and how do you even push back, I guess, against some of that? When did that start for you to be able to speak up, or do you feel like you have to, like maybe when you go back home or you're in some of those same spaces, like say, no, this is not okay? What does that look like for you?
Okay. Let me unpack all that, I think. Let me think on that for a minute. So yeah, I can't get this out of my head. So I grew up in rural Arkansas, and have family in different parts of the state, but there's a town that if we're driving to visit family in this part of the state to go visit those folks over there, there's a sundown town that we have to drive through. And when you drive, like when you hit the city limits, there is a billboard that is sponsored by like White Pride Radio. And usually what it says is diversity is a code word for white genocide. Okay, so there are communities, when I go home, like sometimes that's in my face, right? But it's not all like that, but that's part of going home. And yeah, there's some code switching, you know, that happens sometimes. Getting my PhD, doing my training as a psychologist, changed me a lot. I gained a lot more competency, cultural competence, Dr. Parker. Like, I'm so glad that you are helping our Lander students early in their education to gain that competence, because it unfortunately came quite a bit later for me. And it's been a long process. I'm still learning. And Cass mentioned, and we were kind of bonding over, you know, as a white person, being able to look back and realize all the mistakes I have made over the course of my life, and my language and my behavior and my actions. There can be a lot of shame in that, and that can be immobilizing. You know, but I am fortunate that as a former counselor and as a psychologist, I have some skills where I know how to work on myself and turn that around, turn that into motivation. Yeah, but it's hard. It's kind of hard to go home sometimes, those spaces.
Yeah, that worries me a bit, because when I think about that, I think about all the kids that are still there, and hopefully they're becoming more like you, and they're developing their own minds, and they're getting out to kind of see. But when you think of that message that's there, because that's what we're talking about, like what are the messages you're sending, and when you have this whole community that's there, it's like,
yeah,
You know what I mean? It's, and I think that then is me as a parent is what I am warning my students about. I remember that when I went to my first pre-college program, it was a off away from our city. So I was an Upward Bound kid, a trio student program, and I spent 6 weeks on campus at Notre Dame every summer. I'm from South Bend, so that was home. But then I had an opportunity to go down to Terre Haute, Indiana, and if you know about that, and there's some sundown towns you have to go through to spend 2 weeks there for. It was like this other kind of accelerated summer program, and my mom, her warning kind of was like warning me about other places. And I didn't listen at that time. I was like, no, Mom, it's not like that. And she was saying, no, you're going to come across people. You feel safe there now at Notre Dame because people know you. There's people who come from these different places. They're told different things. You have to know how to operate. And she was right. When I got there were kids who came from all over the place that was like, oh my God, I can't believe that's how you're being taught. And hopefully that experience, though, broke something in them as well and showed them that there was more to it. But that just makes me think about, that and how people who grow up in that space, what's happening to them. And so sometimes, even though we're saying as parents, we tell our own children, but I guess I go back to what Mrs. Kaufman is saying. Sometimes we do have a responsibility for other people and other kids. And you know what I mean? I think to the Don Quixotes when he does the "What would you do" segments, and sometimes we have to be those ones who are speaking up for the outside people. So yeah, I don't know. It's scary.
That's an extreme example, right, of some very overt expressions of racism. But the space that I tend to focus on now is the covert, the underlying. Because if we're able to walk around going, I'm not racist, like I don't do that, obviously, then it lets you kind of get away with never examining those subtle underlying assumptions and beliefs. And yeah. So that's the space where I tend to engage in conversation with other white people. I'm doing more of that in my teaching. So like in my Psych 101 class right now, we're talking about ways that our brains work. And they're built for efficiency, which means we rely a lot on mental shortcuts like stereotypes. And that's the space because your brain works that way. You're a human with a human brain. But that means you have to be vigilant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you're right. You know what? One thing I did notice, and I think I might have appreciated more about coming to the South, because I guess if y'all hadn't picked up on it, I'm from Northern Indiana, where there's so much more, I think, covert expressions at time and a lot of the institutional racism. But one thing I appreciated when I moved here was that at least I could tell what was what, and I knew I could deal with that easier. I could address it better. It's like when the little things are happening, that is actually to me sometimes a bigger problem because there's so many of these little, covert things and you're missing it, but it's all adding together. It makes me think about in Psych 101, we teach about stress, right? And sometimes we say sometimes the daily hassles all added together is worse than one major stress event, right? And so that's sometimes how I guess I think about it. And we call them microaggressions, right? And when those things start to pile on, and they're probably are harder to combat because there's so many little things happening. And I find those are probably the things that are also harder for me to talk to my children about because they often miss them a little bit. But those things are impacting their lives.
I know we're coming to the end of time, Dr. Parker. Something I was thinking about as you all were sharing is that I don't believe anyone here has said their parents talk to them too much about racism. Like that never seems to be a thing. Like they talk too much about race or, they talk too much about prejudice. It's often like, I had this rude awakening when I went to college, or I went to a predominantly white institution, or I had friends and I discovered this or drove through this town. And so, yeah, I'm curious to know, do you feel like that's true, that it's rare that anybody's like, my parents talk too much about race and prejudice, that oftentimes people seem underprepared as opposed to prepared for these kinds of conversations?
Did somebody else want to address that? Dr. Watts, did you want to respond to what Reverend Carter Thomas just said? Or I know you were just coming in. Do you need to repeat it?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
No, you're good. I was also reading what you put in the chat, the comment theme. So thank you. Yeah, storytelling. I was just saying how from reading through the chat and the discussion here and the recorded one, it doesn't seem that anybody's experience is that their parents talk too much about race or too much about prejudice, or that they were like completely prepared for the world. And goes back to what Dr. Sutter Dobbs said. Most of the time, it's the things we can't prepare for, right? The things that catch us off guard. So I'm curious, is it a consensus that oftentimes we're not prepared or not able to prepare our children? Even what you said, Dr. Parker, about how do you name the microaggression? You know, it's hard to say, hey, if you walk into a store and someone starts following you, I mean, you could do that with lots of stories, right? Like there are those stories. If you get pulled over, do this. If you walk into a store and someone's following you, you know, don't put the candy bar, don't walk out with it, grab a bag. Black parents of color would be exhausted if those stories, you know, if you had to, because you would say something every time a child walked out of the house. Remember to do this. Take your hood off. Maybe someone might think you're someone. Take your hat. Respect your teacher. And so I'm curious to know, do we assume, or is it a consensus that most people are underprepared for these kinds of conversations about race and prejudice and the bias and prejudice that they'll face in the world, that most of us are underprepared as opposed to prepared or overprepared, that most times parents haven't had enough of these conversations?
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, we definitely had a lot of conversations, and I guess too, even when growing up, I didn't realize what my mom was doing. We were having these conversations, like, you know, given these different topics and making sure that I'm, you know, thinking about decisions that I'm making. And so it really didn't hit me until I got older and started realizing even the conversations we have now, like, wow, okay, there was a lot that you endured that you're teaching me now, and I'm being more intentional about it than probably when I was a child. I also realized too that sometimes, as a child, I'll listen to my mom's like, okay, I get it, I hear you, the passiveness, right? But then realizing that when it hit me is when I was really going to experience it, is when it actually happened to me, and then being able to reflect from that. And so sometimes it was about waiting for me to, like, if this is something I'm going to experience, and then when I do, I'm like, okay, wow, now I need to sit down and have this conversation again and really rethink about what I've been taught, but then how do I move forward in that situation? So I've noticed that sometimes I've ignored some of the things that were said, but then realizing in the end, like, okay, until it actually hit me and it affected me in some type of way is when I started to realize it was time to reflect or figure out, make that change. Or, if it was my own bias, then, trying to unpack what that looked and felt like too.
Mm-hmm. I think that for me, I've come to terms that this is a process. We're never going to be fully prepared for everything that we're going to hit. There's always going to be something new. I even changed course on this past week in the cultural competence course because the NCAA gave me so much to discuss in terms of gender difference and gender bias and how they treated women. And I said, oh, we got to switch course. I was like, our society never ceases to amaze me and give me something to talk about, something I didn't think I would ever have to mention, right? And so I think what you have to prepare for is maybe this overall resilience, this general sense of just staying true to who you are, being firm. There's always going to be these differences and these other types of situations, but I don't know that we can ever truly prepare someone for every little thing they're going to come about, because we just don't know what that's going to be. And some things are very blatant and they might fit into a specific category, but I do think that it's a constant kind of teaching. But then I also, like Dr. Watts was saying, sometimes our children, either their maturity level is different, so they're processing it in a different way. They hear you, or because it just really hasn't happened to them, they just don't believe that they're going to be affected by it. And it doesn't matter until they run into that, situation. No matter, to me, it's, and this might be a bad analogy, I don't know, but the same way we get told all the time, don't text and drive, don't text and drive. It's dangerous. And you're like, yes, I hear you. I know. Okay. it doesn't really ring home until you're texting that one day and you nearly get into an accident and you wake up. He's like, okay, I need to listen to that. And maybe that was right. And so it's like, until you truly kind of get into that experience, it doesn't wake you up. So I don't know. I mean, I think we're always going to be underprepared. I think we can just be prepared to the extent that we're willing to be open, to have conversations with people, to address the problems that people are standing up to be allies. I never know what the world is going to deal me in a day. And so I'm just prepared for the unexpected, I suppose. And I think that's what I try to prepare my children for, is the unexpected, because I don't know what those individual situations are going to be for them. We kind of need to go around looking at the time. Again, we always run out of time. Mrs. Kaufman, any last thoughts on this? Any advice, or what would you want to leave our audience with this conversation?
Well, I've always been amazed that Black people speak to white people. Your grace and your mercy is amazing. This is my last this is from our hero in our family. This is a little Abraham Lincoln. And when he left Springfield, Illinois to go to DC, and he would never return alive, this is what he said to his people. Trusting in him who can go with me and remain with you and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care commending you, as I hope in you, your prayers to commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell. I hope things will be better soon. And I think we're going to have to, I think whites are going to have to really be your advocates in a very strong way.
I think we caught everything you said in a strong way, but I know your audio, for me at least, ended, but we caught what you said. So thank you for that. Thank you. And I look forward to continuing and building and working.
And again, I
advocate and ally.
Right. And I thank the Black race for just giving us a chance.
Okay. Dr. Lopez, any closing remarks?
Yes, just a word on teaching by example. You know, I think that's very important. Teaching by example, activism by example, not just by protesting, not just by, doing the talk. We all need to show how it's done, and it's by our actions daily, not just on activism days. Daily, the things we do daily. I think that's the best remedy.
Good. Dr. Watts.
I was just writing down a few words here, and I was thinking like processing and reflect are two things that's probably very important too. And one of the things I kept thinking about, my son's very young right now, but this is an ongoing process. And then knowing that for me, or just something else to think about, is being willing to make that change as he continues to grow, because he's going to experience different things. And so now knowing that and being a little bit more aware that, the things that I'm talking about now, that talk's going to continue to grow and continue to be ongoing, and being willing and ready for what that looks like. And so especially when I'm thinking about parenting and telling stories, just knowing that it's going to change a little bit, but being ready for what that looks like for him, and for any other children that we end up having too, or who I'm around during that time. So just knowing that change is coming, and being willing and ready and open for that.
Yes. And Reverend Carter Thomas, what say you?
There's been a lot of good words.
Mm-hmm.
I'm grateful to be a part of this conversation, and conversations that need to happen. In many ways, this is just something I wanted to share. A friend of mine had posted this. She often shares her art, and sometimes it's like really elaborate, but often it's about social issues. And I'm going to try to share it from my phone. But she's a Korean American woman, and this was her sharing. Stephanie and Mathis shared, I am an Asian woman. I am not a problem to be eliminated. And this is often work she does with her children as Korean American children, that she often does art as a way of like explaining to them, like, this is what's happening in the world. Her children are younger, so she's like, I'm not necessarily showing them the news, but I'm telling them in an age appropriate way. This is what's happening to our community. And she's used art as a way to have hard conversations and healing, and has taught me a lot just through seeing her post on social media. And so I acknowledge that we've had a lot of good content about reading and storytelling, reading history specifically, and traveling, and doing art and having conversations, taking the time. And as you said, it's a process. And so thank you for that, Dr. Watts, naming that. We have epiphanies as we keep living and keep journeying. And as we say often in Black communities, like, keep on living. Like when you say, oh, that, you know, someone says, well, I don't really believe that, or I've never experienced that. And, you know, the elders say, keep on living. And so I do think as we keep living, we encounter the horrors and the joy of being in community with people and having hard conversations. And I'm so grateful that this has been a space where those conversations get to happen and new people join us. And so thank you all for joining us. And the survey's at the bottom, so please take the survey because it helps us.
And I like that you mentioned the joy. And so I want to end on that, because as much as, you know, I can be frustrated at times and nervous and afraid for my children, I also find so many moments of joy in these conversations, and to bridge the gaps. And I actually forgot, and we got into our conversation. I'm going to share it as well, but there was an interesting video, and I have to pull up the link, so I think I might have to post it on Facebook, unless Reverend Carter Thomas, if you're able to access that link. And it was about Orangeburg, South Carolina, and it was about, and Mrs. Kaufman, you might actually like that video. I say that we all might, but in particular, I think it speaks to what you're talking about, how your family was very intentional about where your children went to school and not running away from it. And it's about a white family and a white girl who's the only, or one of the few only white girls in an all Black school at OW in Orangeburg, South Carolina. This is all very recent. And her family making that commitment to say, we could go somewhere else, but we want to be a part of the solution. And we made a commitment that, yes, I might be the only white girl here, but this is the space I live in, and I want to be a part of bringing us together. And so it was a very interesting video. So I hope that you guys do click on that link when we're done here and watch that video. And it just struck me that it's in Orangeburg, South Carolina, and that there are still these spaces that exist. But, you know, I find so much joy, though, in being able to have these conversations. And I hope that we feel like all of you who are a part of this, that you are doing your part, that we are helping to come to some resolution, to opening minds, to sharing thoughts, that things that we may not have thought about, gaining different perspective. And that's really what it's about. And you'll find it'll come over time. And, you know, sharing things with our children, and depending on their age, you know, maybe going back, even utilizing these videos to then open up conversation. Perhaps you have teenagers and you can have these talks and those different things. So I am encouraged by the work that we're doing. And I just want to continue to push that we keep talking to one another, even outside of this, inviting other people to be a part of the conversations with you. I want to thank Mrs. Nicholson, who was a part of our pre-recorded. She had another thing to do, so she wasn't able to be here with us tonight, but just wanted to name that we appreciate her contributions to the conversation. And again, ask you all, please take the survey. When you get an opportunity, you can click on the link there. We'll probably send it out again tomorrow. I think each of you who've participated, Dr. Lopez, Mrs. Kaufman, Dr. Watts, really, really appreciate your time and just being thought partners on this and pushing us forward. So I think it's always hard for me to end the broadcast because I never know where to stop. And I see people saying things, but we have to end. We've kept you past time. Please share your feedback, comments. If you have questions, we will take them. And I will officially say that ends our broadcast. Have a good night.